When I was speaking with Leanne about which piece of music I wanted to start with, I was in part attracted to this piece because you might not know, but Anna is a boxer, actually. So that was also not only in honor of Leanne and all of you, but also of Anna, who we thank dearly for everything she does. So I've been struck in steeping myself in the writings of our brilliant guests, and in their artwork, and in their music, and in the remarkable literature that we have in front of us today. Glenn Sean Coulthard's Red Skin, White Masks, Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus, and Leanne Simpson's As We Have Always Done. I've been struck by the critical turns, the critical moves that they make. Audra Simpson's and Leanne Simpson's embrace of the concept of refusal, which Julian Brave NoiseCat discusses so powerfully in his essay on our blog, seems like an extraordinarily productive political strategy in this context. The move of refusal functions to set the terms of the resistance and also of the relationship between the protest, between the resistors and the others. I was also struck by this notion of the rejection of the politics of recognition in Glenn Coulthard's work in this context. And again, in this context, by which I mean the context of sovereign conflict, right? The modes of resistance that we encounter in this seminar are not just individual or group modalities of resistance. They are in large part, of course, but there's also the element of sovereignty as well. Nations, the Standing Rock Sioux, the Iroquois nations, and others. And this produces a demarcation with the other forms of resistance and uprisings that we've been studying in this seminar, and a demarcation that Nicole Willis discusses in her blog and that we'll talk about today, about the important implications for political action in, at times, a sovereign-to-sovereign encounter, right? Which is something that we really haven't had in Uprising 1313 yet. And it raises many particular and specific issues in this context about forms of resistance, about overcoming problems, some problems of essentialization. And so reading from the Redskins' White Mask, right, it's particularly relevant from the perspective of indigenous peoples' struggles, where activists may sometimes employ what appear to outsiders as essentialist notions of culture and tradition in their efforts to transcend oppressive structures and practices, right? So challenging an anti-essentialism that at the same time challenges politics of recognition in an effort to then question the essentializations that are made about the arguments themselves. All of these are, I find, fascinating moves. There are many common features with some of the other forms of resistance that we've been exploring this year, some features of nonviolence that we've spent a lot of time talking about, or issues of breaking silence that we've spoken about, the use of the media, et cetera. And yet, the social movements and the forms of resistance that we're going to talk about today have particular unique features that we're going to talk about. The domestic anti-colonial struggle, the nature of a domestic anti-colonial struggle. We've seen anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism in other contexts, in the context of the Arab uprisings, for instance, and elsewhere. But here we're dealing with a domestic U.S. anti-colonial struggle. The form that it takes at Standing Rock in terms of a settlement or an encampment, and the contrasts that we can draw and see with other forms of resistance, such as occupations, which may look the same at times, but are very different than an encampment or a setting up of a reclaiming of a territory. The notions of sovereignty and of counter-sovereignty that are developed in the literature, and the spirituality, which we had talked a lot about in the context with Pérouse, in the context of Foucault and Iran. But different notions of spirituality here that have different paths. So to help us explore these unique dimensions of the Standing Rock protests, of this form that I'd like to call standing ground, we have 4 exceptional artists, activists, and scholars. We have, and I'll introduce them quickly, and then they'll make some presentations, and then we'll open up the conversation. So we're going to start with Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, who is a writer, poet, musician, activist, and faculty member at the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning in Denende, and a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson University in Toronto. She's the author of several books, including Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, The Gift is in the Making, Islands of Decolonial Love, and This Accident of Being Lost. Her most recent book, which we've been reading, is As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, which was just published in 2017 by the University of Minnesota Press. She's the editor of several collected volumes as well, and she's published extensive fiction and poetry in both book and magazine form. As you saw, she's a musician who combines poetry, storytelling, songwriting, and performance in collaboration with musicians to create unique spoken songs and soundscapes. Leanne is Michi Sagik Nishnabeg. She holds a PhD from the University of Manitoba, and she's a member of the Alderville First Nation, and she'll be our first speaker. Afterwards, we'll hear from Julian Brave NoiseCat, and we're delighted to have Julian back at Columbia. Julian was a student here at the college, graduating in 2015. Is that right? And so we're really delighted to have him back. He's an author and an activist. He's currently a policy analyst at 350.org in Washington, D.C. He was formerly an urban fellow in the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development, as well as the Native Issues Fellow at the Huffington Post. He has published several chapters: Disruption Beyond Standing Rock, The Indigenous Fight for Equitable Infrastructure in the Van Allen Report 19 in 2017. Also, Slaying the Carbon-Consuming Colonial Hydra, Indigenous Contributions to Climate Action in Development, which is the flagship journal of the Society for International Development, also in 2017. While he was here at Columbia, he was the co-president of the Native American Council. And then after leaving Columbia, he received the prestigious Clarendon Scholarship to study global and imperial history at the University of Oxford. So he spent a year there. And recently, he's been receiving a lot of awards, including the 2017 HCN Playa Diverse Westerns Voices Award, first place Best Editorial Prize for the Native American Journalists Association, and you've read his piece and the several other pieces that he's written recently. He's an enrolled member of the Kanim Lake Band Tsik Essen in British Columbia and a descendant of the Lil Wat Nation of Mount Currie. So after Julian, we'll hear from Nicole Willis, and we're also delighted to have Nicole back at Columbia. Actually, Nicole was a graduate of Columbia Law School. What was it? Was it 2012?
10 years ago next month.
10 years ago next month. Bat an eyelash and a decade passes. Nicole Willis is a political consultant and government affairs specialist, and she also serves as the Tribal Relations Director for the City of Seattle, and she joins us from Seattle today. She has worked on numerous campaigns and recently spent a year working with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe as they fought the Dakota Access Pipeline. She worked as the lead on tribal policy and strategy for both the Bernie Sanders 16 and the Obama 08 campaigns, and served as an appointee in the Secretary's office at the U.S. Department of Labor. She got her BA from Yale and her JD here from Columbia Law School. She's an enrolled member of the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation and is also Yakama, Nipese, and Oglala Lakota. And then after we've had those three presentations, we'll hear from Jaskiran Dhillon, who joins us from the New School in southern Manhattan. Professor Dhillon is a first-generation academic and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Cree and Métis territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Committed to the tenets of public intellectualism, Professor Dhillon's scholarship is intimately connected to and informed by on-the-ground advocacy and direct action. Her work spans the field of settler colonialism, anthropology of the state, anti-racist and indigenous feminism, youth studies, colonial violence, and indigenous studies. And she's published widely in The Guardian, Cultural Anthropology, Truth Out, Public Seminar, Feminist Formations, and Decolonization, among others. Her first book is called Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth, Decolonization, and the Politics of Intervention from 2017. And it provides a critical ethnographic account of state interventions in the lives of urban indigenous youth. And her focus now for her research is on developing an anti-colonial critique of the environmental justice movement by examining indigenous political movements working against the extractive industry, including the resistance at Standing Rock. She's also the guest editor of a special issue of Environment and Society that foregrounds indigenous resistance to and theorizing of climate change. And she's the co-editor, along with Nick Estes, of No Dapple and Mni Wikoni, Reflections on Standing Rock, which is going to be released in 2018 from the University of Minnesota Press. Professor Dhillon is a professor of global studies and anthropology at the New School, and she's a member of the New York City Stands with Standing Rock Collective. So please join me in welcoming our extraordinary guests for what is going to be a remarkable panel. Leanne, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Bonjour, Kinuaya. Gediga Bijuna Danuema, Kinagachia Nishnavek Ogming, Nadonjaba, Nagojawan Megwado da, Petasmusake, Nidijnikas, Nigachinendem Gibajayan, Nongama, Andae, Kinawa, Lenape, Aki, Chimigwech, Gibajayan, Gibib Watchenguk, Chimigwech for coming. The video that opens the workshop today is a song from my album Flight that was released about a year ago from RPM Records. And the filmmaker that made the video is Elmaya Tailfeathers, who is Blackfoot and Sami. And it featured the Nohawk boxer Ivy Richardson and her family. And she's from Vancouver Island. And we did this collaboration as sort of a refusal of the horrific phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people, and the target that's on our back. So thank you, Bernard, for opening with it. It's an honor to be here. It's wonderful to see so many Indigenous students here. Hi. I know it's a busy time of year for you guys. And it's also an honor to be on this panel with so much brilliance. I started my blog post with the idea that Indigenous peoples have been engaged in over 4 centuries of resistance against this violent backdrop of conquest, genocide, expansive dispossession, unfettered capitalist exploitation, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and environmental apocalypse. Because this is something that I've been thinking a lot about in my work. I was born into the longest running social movement in Canadian history and one that predates Canada. It's a miracle, not in the magic sense, but in an against all odds sense, that I'm here today, alive, living in my territory, speaking my language, learning to think with inside Anishinaabe thought. It's a miracle because it means that generations of people in my family and my nation fought so that I could first physically be alive and exist, that I have access to the land that we have left, to the pieces of culture that we have left, the bits of languages, elders, and our thoughts. And this was a tremendous struggle full of sacrifice. In my last book, As We Have Always Done, I point to this idea of generations of generative refusal in the context of a relentless struggle for Indigenous life and freedom in what is now often called Indigenous resurgence. And I draw on the work of the brilliant Mohawk scholar from Columbia, Audra Simpson, also the Dene political theorist Glenn Coulthard, and the Dene Cree scholar Jarrett Martineau. So the idea is to refuse colonialism in all its manifestations, but through our collective action, generate or affirm Indigenous presence. In other words, refuse and then build Indigenous other worlds and then live in those worlds. So refuse the pipeline and build the scaffolding that collectively propels Indigenous life and freedom in the way of the pipeline. My reasons for this thinking are embedded in Anishinaabe thought. Part of the anti-intellectualism of Western theory and the academy is that the idea that Indigenous peoples are not thinking peoples, that we are not contemporary, that we are not intellectual, and that we certainly aren't theoretical. In Canada, this was a deliberate strategy on the part of the colonizer because it placed us as less human and was a way to justify all the violent things done to us in order to remove us from the land so they could get the resources. It is and was used as a justification for racist and paternalistic policies that were amalgamated in the first Indian Act of 1876 that places Indians as children and the state as a benevolent father rather than the violent, abusive father that the state is, and regulates every aspect of Indigenous life. So this, of course, led to residential schools and the 60s scoop. In terms of knowledge, Indigenous knowledge then is ignored, erased, or appropriated if it's useful to the colonizer. It never stands on its own. It's only as valid as Western knowledge to the degree to which it conforms or is useful to colonizers. The evidence of that is that we've had Indigenous nations resisting colonialism in the Americas for 4 centuries, and it is still rather rare that we include Indigenous theory in anti-colonial thought or discussions of liberatory theory until we have events like the brilliant people of Standing Rock, for instance, making it impossible for us to ignore. Anishinaabe people are thinking people. Our fish clans are the intellectuals and responsible for nurturing the rigorous, robust bodies of knowledge that continually generate life in our territory since the very beginning. Intellectual thought is a part of our political practices. It is a part of our daily lives. Our theory looks different than Western theory. It is created, animated, amplified, and embodied in the context of relationships. It is deeply and intimately relational. It is for everyone in our community, including our kids, encoded in our stories, literal layers, conceptual layers, metaphoric layers, links to other bodies of knowledge. It is practiced. It is kinetic, robust, rigorous, complex, and diverse. It is epistemological, ontological, and axiological. It's oral, and it comes from the land. It exists in a context where colonialism has continued to attack it, and Western thought has almost continuously tried to diminish, erase, historicize, or at best misunderstand it. Our creation stories are our sort of meta-theory. And for the Anishinaabe, those stories teach us that knowledge is a combination of intellectual thought, and that's often represented in the sound of the shaker, and heart knowledge, emotional knowledge, which is represented in the sound of our drum beat. These stories tell us that the capacity of human knowledge is so vast that it can't just sit in our heads, that it spills out into all aspects of our bodies. These stories say that kinetic energy, movement, and motion is a crucial part of life. Our theories are generated not through decontextualized thought, like sitting alone with my computer and a bunch of books, but through the collective embodiment of our practices. This is the idea that we don't stop the pipeline by just thinking, research, and writing about the pipeline, but we stop it by strategically organizing and mobilizing and placing our bodies on the land in front of it, or as Glenn says, putting our bodies between settlers and their money. We don't just vision or dream a different future. We build that different future in the path of the pipeline, even if we aren't successful, even if it only lasts for a very short time, because it's in these spaces our bodies and our spirits and our families learn what freedom feels like. Every time we build that other world, we get better at it. Every time we build that other world, we generate more Indigenous theory about how to realize it. We plant the seeds for a different future. My ancestors got up every day and they made things. They aligned themselves with those creation stories. They built their present, and that gave birth to my present. They made their political system. They made their food systems, their transportation networks, their education, their healthcare, their economic system. If they didn't get up and make it, it didn't exist, because they invested heavily in relationships rather than institutions. They were producers. They produced systems. They produced their world, and then they lived in it. They lived aligned with those theories. And if it didn't work, they got up the next day and they built it again, over and over and over again. They lived resurgence. Right now, I can fairly easily go through my life without making anything. I can just consume things. I can just buy things. But you can't buy a movement, and you can't buy mobilization. I was thinking about this yesterday when I was on the plane flying here. My ancestors at this time of year would have canoed here. My territory is the north shore of Lake Ontario, so the route would have been using the rivers and the lakes. It would have taken longer than 6 hours. We would have had to travel through Haudenosaunee territory. We would have had to visit, practice diplomacy, share food, share ceremony. We would have had to hunt and fish along the way with the permission of the Haudenosaunee. Our kids would have come with us. We would have come out of the journey different than we went in. We would have come out of the journey having strengthened international relationships in order to get here. Those ideas and those relationships would have generated new thinking and new ideas in their internationalism. I was also thinking, where do I find myself surrounded by this Indigenous brilliance? Where does it exist right now? Well, it exists in ceremony. It exists inside our communities, in our family, on the land, and in our mobilizations. On the surface, this can look like it's a hyper-local endeavor, but in deeply relational systems, nothing could be further from the truth. If you think of that journey from my home, on the north shore of Lake Ontario to here, we're interacting with plant nations, we're interacting with animal nations, we're interacting with the surrounding Indigenous nations. We're living alongside our ancestors and those yet born. We are thinking and making decisions and creating a reality that will give birth to the next 7 generations. We are traveling, visiting, listening to others, nurturing diplomacy, and talking about those that face similar circumstances. Large sustained mobilizations like at Standing Rock or Ganasatake or Elsipuktuk or Grassy Narrows or the Unistoten camp make resistance visible to Canadians and Americans, although it's mitigated through this racist mainstream media. What often remains unseen to the outside is the animation, the amplification, and the embodiment of Indigenous ethics, theories, and politics that generate these other worlds, the realities and the collectives that sustain Indigenous resistance. These mobilizations create zones, albeit often temporary, that perform decolonial life based on deep, shared, reciprocal relationality. Collective spaces where Indigenous people live their own visions of self-determination and freedom, perhaps imperfectly, and perhaps briefly, are tremendous manifestations of Indigenous alternatives to the colonial state and everything it employs. Theory generated through and informed by this collective reciprocal action has continually generated Indigenous nations and Indigenous life. So in the context of resistance, generative refusal not only refuses colonialism, but it affirms a different present by generating different worlds, worlds that center the material and spiritual needs of the community. It has once local and international, ethically asking us to consider our actions and our solidarity across nations and through time and space. Often marginalized and poorly understood from within Western anti-colonial thought and liberatory theory, Indigenous intelligence represents a robust and rigorous body of thought and practice that has propelled Indigenous life since the beginning. So Indigenous life, freedom, and resistance offers important interventions into the way in which we theorize, organize, mobilize, and refuse colonialism in all its insidious forms. Miigwech.
Thank you, Leanne. That was a brilliant way to start the conversation, since we focus on theory so much here. So that grounding kind of in the relational and in the example of the travel was really helpful. Thank you. Julian?
Wade, Julian Brave, NoiseCat, one Sklex, one Kikachet, Esquestua Alexander Radias, one Kekachet, Esquestua Edarchi NoiseCat, Sequachmuchen, Estatlimken, Tetsk Esken, Wechdekwen, Letwen, Poopsman, Eliatik Tamich, Wedlanape Uluch. Hello, everyone. My name is Julian Brave NoiseCat. I'm a proud member of the Cannon Lake Band Tikeskin and descendant of the Lillooet Nation of Mount Currie. And I want to acknowledge our presence here today on Lenape traditional territory and say hello to all my relatives from the Native American Council at Columbia University. I tell you who I come from and where I come from. I tell you where I am and whose lands I stand upon. I tell you in two languages to maximize your opportunity to understand. I tell you because these things matter. Our ancestors, the land, our origin stories, our histories. These things ground us so that we can look forward with a proper perspective to shape our collective future. These things matter. As I begin my talk, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous communities fighting for their rights, their survival, and their freedom across Turtle Island or North America. In the Louisiana Bayou, the Hauma Nation is leading a courageous fight against Energy Transfer Partners' Bayou Bridge pipeline, which activists have described as the southern tail of Dakota access. In the Arctic, the Gwich'in Nation is forming the last line of defense against oil drilling in their traditional homelands. In Anishinaabe territory, present-day Minnesota, a coalition of Ojibwe nations and grassroots activists are looking to stop Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline. In so-called British Columbia, Salish nations, including my own Secwepemc people, have banded together with allies and, for the moment, stalled the advance of Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline. In the Nocedi-Shakowin territory, primarily in what is now South Dakota, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Pawnee, and Ponca people, as well as ranchers and landowners in Nebraska, are preparing for yet another stand against Keystone XL, the zombie pipeline that never dies. These incursions into Indigenous homelands are but the latest attack on Indigenous communities in a centuries-long history of colonization. Across the Anglo-colonized world, from Canada to Australia, South Africa, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and beyond, settler nations and empires have been built upon the death and dispossession of Indigenous peoples, communities, nations, and confederacies. In combination with wealth extracted from enslaved Africans and the happenstance abundance of coal deposits in the British Isles, millions of acres of stolen Indigenous lands fed the rise of the British and later the Americans. For a time, abundant land and bountiful natural resources gave settlers access to cheap capital, giving rise to the property-owning American dream, that idyllic home on the crabgrass frontier with a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. In the crucible of these new worlds, European settlers and immigrants from nations as disparate as Hungary and Ireland refashioned themselves white. Railways cut through dispossessed indigenous lands created an integrated national market, stretching from sea to shining sea. Gold extracted from indigenous mountains and streams filled the coffers of kings and capitalists. The epic frontier myth, retold in countless spaghetti westerns, remains today quintessential Americana. We have been told that this deep colonial history is peripheral to the grand drama of a modernity and progress, but in fact, it is central. Without the dispossession of indigenous peoples, the structures of settler colonialism and imperialism would, quite literally, have no ground to stand upon. This American Leviathan once rumbled forward as though driven by divine prophecy. In 1845, journalist John O'Sullivan described this nation's inevitable ascendancy as, quote, manifest destiny. But today, its advance appears tepid, its future in question, its decline maybe even inevitable. The current commander-in-chief's slogan admits that the nation has fallen from its preeminent perch. Despite distaste for the president's bombastic style, analysts and intellectuals tend to agree, foretelling the rise of China and the inevitability of an Asian age. The accelerating climate crisis, fueled foremost by America's ravenous appetite for fossil fuels, exacts a mounting toll. In the 21st century, scarce resources and a growing population forebode mass displacement and human conflict that will test the resilience of national and global institutions, including the nation-state itself. As democracy and planet slip into a new age of anxiety, pipelines like Keystone XL and Dakota Access have become a peculiar barometer and apt symbol of this global unraveling. Today, a cohort of conservative, quote-unquote, strategic realists argue that energy independence will prolong American hegemony. This year, oil production in the United States is projected to beat Saudi Arabia. Powerful geopolitical and economic interests intertwine in pipelines. Drinking water, sacred sites, and climate be damned. Every single project connecting global markets to the Athabasca oil sands in present-day Alberta, the Bakken in North Dakota, and Permian in Texas locks humanity and planet into decades of increased carbon emissions, kiting the globe closer and closer to the climate tipping point. The oil pipe life support, built to prolong the waning American century, heralds the cataclysmic onset of the Anthropocene. In this context, an enduring but perhaps waning colonial present, I traveled to the Kulwichaso Yate's Lower Brule Reservation in November. As we came together on the banks of the Missouri River, some 300 miles south, the Nebraska Public Service Commission convened to decide the fate of TransCanada Corporation's Keystone XL pipeline, and with it, the fate of people, communities, and nations like this one in the project's path. After a few nervous cups of coffee and a prayer, word arrived. In a split decision, 3-2, Nebraska lawmakers approved Keystone XL. In the era of America First, Native nations pay the price once again. Quote, "Nothing has changed at all in our defense of land, air, and water of the Oceti-Sakowin lands," Faith Spotted Eagle, leader of the Braveheart Society, said in a snap press conference held after the decision was announced. If anything, it has become more focused, stronger, and more adamant after Standing Rock. Across Indian country, and particularly here in Oceti Sakowin territory, Standing Rock has already become the point of reference against which contemporary social movements and political happenings are measured. There was an Indian country before Standing Rock, and now there is an Indian country post-Standing Rock. Over the past year, dozens of headlines have declared movements against the Jordan Cove, Line 3, and Kinder Morgan pipelines, as well as land theft at Bears Ears and countless other struggles, the, quote, next Standing Rock. This is because Standing Rock is not over. The struggles that shaped that fight for indigenous rights and sovereignty, for environmental justice, for sacred lands, and for water that sustains life persist, as they have for over 400 years. From Standing Rock to Queensland, with bodies in the path of bulldozers, police, and private security, indigenous peoples are breaking away from the colonial machine by asserting sovereignty at the very junctures where the political and economic joints of the structures we oppose are welded together. We are insisting on more just and reciprocal relations between the people, the land, and the water we share. Relations rooted first and foremost in indigenous communities and not nation-states. Recent groundbreaking work in indigenous studies can help us think with these indigenous traditions and movements. In her groundbreaking first book, Mohawk Interruptus, Ganawage Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson asks what it means to be a member of her Ganawage community. Her study is animated by the tension between her role as an anthropologist and her citizenship as Ganawage. Her academic discipline is rooted in the production of colonial knowledge and power, examining quote-unquote others with ossified units of analysis like clan units and kinship charts, turning ethnographic subjects into governable categories. As a Mohawk citizen, on the other hand, Simpson belongs to an indigenous nation that refuses the governance of the American and Canadian settler states. These two exist in tension. This conflict between the disciplinary imperative to represent and the political imperative to refuse energizes her work in remarkably productive ways. With painstaking vigor, she shows that settler colonialism, the structure that seeks to dispossess and eliminate indigenous political and corporal bodies, has failed, and that indigenous sovereignty endures in the maw of domination. But Simpson's most enduring contribution is her articulation of refusal. Interviewing her Mohawk compatriots who use every opportunity to remind non-native people that this is not their land and that there are other Mohawk possibilities that are possible, she develops their posture into refusal into theory and practice. Quote, "They refuse to consent to the apparatuses of the state," she writes in an essay for Cultural Anthropology. "And in time with that, I refused then and still do now to tell the internal story of their struggle. But I consent to telling the story of their constraint." Yellowknives Dene political theorist Glenn Coulthard is perhaps the leading critic of indigenous constraint. In his award-winning Red Skin, White Masks, Coulthard draws on the works of Marx, Fanon, Sartre, and others, as well as the history of Dene struggle, to launch a studied broadside on the edifice of contemporary colonialism. Since the 1970s, powerful indigenous movements in Canada, the United States, Australia, and Aotearoa, as well as elsewhere, have fomented a profound shift in colonial governance from policies, ideologies, and techniques of assimilation and integration to a new and enduring paradigm of self-determination, rights, and recognition. Despite these reforms to accommodate a small measure of indigenous self-determination, state power remains colonial. As Coulthard writes, "In the Canadian context, colonial relations of power are no longer reproduced primarily through overtly coercive means, but rather through asymmetrical exchanges of mediated forms of state recognition and accommodation." The implications of this argument are controversial. As Coulthard says, Much of our efforts over the last 4 decades to attain settler state recognition of our rights to land and self-government have in fact encouraged the opposite: the continued dispossession of our homelands and the ongoing usurpation of our self-determining authority. Or to put it simply, we've been played. In his willingness to pull no punches and depart from more conciliatory and professionalized schools of Indigenous political thought, advocacy, and organization, Coulthard finds solidarity and perhaps even vindication in the remarkable success of movements like Standing Rock, which advanced Indigenous self-determination in ways more traditional, state-centered channels of campaigning and litigating never could have achieved. As he wrote in a 2012 blog post for the journal Decolonization, quote, "If history has shown us anything, it is this. If you want those in power to respond swiftly to Indigenous peoples' political efforts, start by placing native bodies, with a few logs and tires thrown in for good measure, between settlers and their money, which in colonial contexts is generated by the ongoing theft and exploitation of our land and resource base." But as a political act, refusal is a double negative. When we refuse the desecration of our waters, the dispossession of our lands, and the destruction of our worlds, what are we assenting to? In their adroit articulation of the structures we must spurn, Simpson and Coulthard offer powerful beginnings. Simpson's book lends itself most immediately to a careful consideration of Indigenous political orders, communities, nations, confederacies as sovereigns. Coulthard's work, meanwhile, lends itself most clearly to a consideration of Indigenous lands, the systems of interrelation and modes of production that must be taken up again to build alternatives to capitalism and colonialism. But the difficult work of collectively imagining and building these Indigenous futures at Standing Rock and beyond is just beginning. If our problem is at least partially one of grammar and words, there is perhaps no better Indigenous thinker or writer to lend her prose to this Indigenous resurgence than Leanne Simpson of the Alderville First Nation. In her 4th book, As We Have Always Done, Simpson welds Indigenous scholarship to teachings handed down by Anishinaabe elders, brilliantly demonstrating through her research and writing process and product what it might be to write with Indigenous theory and intelligence. I'm going to butcher this word, I apologize. Biskabiyang, the process of returning to ourselves, a re-engagement with the things we have left behind, a re-emergence, an unfolding from the inside out, is a concept, an individual and collective process of decolonization and resurgence, she writes. To me, it is the embodied process as freedom. It is a flight out of the structure of settler colonialism and into the processes and relationships of freedom and self-determination encoded in practice within Anishinaabe Win, or grounded normativity. In this creative escape, Simpson's narrative soars in many directions. She writes about land as pedagogy, queerness and two-spiritedness as normative, and Indigenous internationalism, solidarity, and interrelation between Black and Native struggle as central to the emergence and endurance of communities rooted in justice, reciprocity, and freedom. She writes, "When these constellations work in international relationship to other constellations, the fabric of the night sky changes." Back on the Kuawichaso Oyate in November, Ochedi Shakoan leaders and allies re-signed the Protect the Sacred Treaty, promising to defend ancestral homelands against tar sands megaprojects, the Keystone XL pipeline, and the Trump agenda. Quote, "Reaffirm the boundaries of that treaty. Keep out that black snake you have been talking about," Oyate Win brushbreaker told the crowd. She's 97 years old, referring to the Keystone XL pipeline as the black snake, a description from a Lakota prophecy. In Montana, lawmakers representing the No Keystone XL coalition have had some success advocating for legal intervention. There's now potential that the federal review of the pipeline will be reopened for public comment this summer. Faith Spotted Eagle, meanwhile, has joined the Democratic electoral resistance, and in the fall is running for state legislature in South Dakota's 21st District, a district bifurcated by Keystone XL. Her slogan, faith, hope, and leadership. Meanwhile, more than 17,000 people have signed a promise to protect, committing to take nonviolent direct action in the path of the pipeline in solidarity with Indigenous peoples when and if construction begins, likely spring 2019. After we signed the Protect the Sacred Treaty, we came together to dance in victory. As our drummers hit the honor beats, we raised defiant hands. Women held red scarves aloft, representing scalps taken in the victory our people and our planet so desperately need right now. But how that victory will be won and what form it will take, refusal, assent, compromise, or otherwise, remains to be seen. Kukstichem.
Thank you, Julian, brave NoiseCat. Thank you so much. And I'm hoping that we will come back to these questions that you raised about the relationship between refusal and what it is that one is then assenting to. So in the conversation, we'll come back to that. Nicole, Willis, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Great to see so many students here. I ran off and left my notebook catching my 11 p.m. flight, so excuse me while I look at my phone for the notes, which I just tried to recreate. I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about my own path to where I am, not because I want to talk about myself, but because it helps explain why the situation at Standing Rock was so politically unique. In 2007, I was in my 2L year here at Columbia, and I got word from former coworkers in Congress, where I had previously interned, that they were going to work on Senator Barack Obama's campaign, and would I be interested in helping out. I, before that, had been looking at other campaigns, but I thought, you know what, we're not having a very good time with, these other folks who are running. Why not try somebody new that has absolutely no track record with Natives? So I started advising the campaign in February 2007 and went to Chicago that summer. Stayed on throughout the next year, and as soon as I was finished with class, I left and I went out into the field, was based in Chicago. We decided that we wanted to hire a Native vote coordinator in the state of North Dakota. So I immediately thought of my dear friend Jody Gillette, who later came, she and I both served in the administration, and she served at the highest levels in the White House. And of all of the 120 plus Native American appointees in the Obama administration, was probably the closest to him. As you'll recall, in 2014, President Obama visited Cannonball, went to the Cannonball Powwow, which is the home community of Chairman Dave Archambault. It is no coincidence that he visited Standing Rock, having Jody as an employee, not because she begged him to go to her home, but because he knew that they would have a high degree of control over the situation, going to a reservation and a unique kind of community that he didn't regularly get to visit. So that's why they went to Standing Rock. President Obama had a relationship with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe before this happened. And I say this because if you remember back to 2016, April of 2016 was when camp really kicked off. At the same time that was going on, when I met many of these students here, was during the Bernie Sanders campaign, when everybody was wondering why he was paying so much attention to Native Americans, and nobody else had ever done that before. And the truth of the matter is, most of the time you can't get politicians, especially when they're running for the higher office, the harder it is, because Native Americans they don't give a lot of money, and they don't have a lot of votes. Some really good politicians, to them, that doesn't matter. So we had all of these rallies and speeches talking about Native Americans. We had Bernie Sanders celebrity surrogates talking about Native Americans. While she was working for Bernie Sanders, Shailene Woodley was also going back and forth between Standing Rock and getting a lot of her celebrity friends interested in what was happening there. Fast forward to a couple of ugly months later, a lot of people who were frustrated by the boiling point that we had reached in this country politically had this perfect situation to direct their attention to at Standing Rock, where we saw a sovereign nation who had continually been subject to these harsh policies of the United States, like hundreds of other sovereign nations throughout the US, leading a new kind of resistance, an encampment, a refusal, like we've said, to move. Peaceful, just in the way. And it was really, I think it caught the country at a political and emotional point in time when they really needed something to believe in, and they wanted that belief to matter. So you consistently hear from natives who are at the camp, particularly those who are tribal members of the Ocheti-Sakowin tribes, that it was always rooted in faith and prayer. And a lot of people kind of skirt over that issue because to them it's not a religious thing because it doesn't fall in line with their traditional concept of religion. But it follows in line with values of Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and Native American in general values, where you prioritize taking care of the earth and taking care of your resources and ensuring life for future generations. So whether or not that they felt that that was religious or spiritual for them, they were showing up in droves because they wanted something to believe in, and they had faith that their presence would make a difference. And for once in our lives, we saw that it did. What we didn't see or hear a lot about going on in the background is that Jody, at that point in time, was then was a strategic advisor in Washington, D.C., representing the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. We had fellow appointees and friends still working in the administration at the Department of the Interior, Department of Justice. We worked very closely with the White House and the Department of Army, just consistently going back and forth. And I hear and see a lot of blame now, why didn't President Obama do more? And to be sure, there's more that could have been done. But they really did, at that point, they were so far down this road of documentation with the tribe and with the Army Corps that they did put a lot of unseen effort into kind of turning things around. The one area that I will probably never be satisfied with is that the Department of Justice didn't intervene with North Dakota law enforcement's behavior and their collaboration with private security firms. I think that's still a huge civil rights issue that goes unaddressed with regards to Standing Rock. Let me refer to my notes here. I'm going to pivot to media now. So a huge part of the reason of our success at Standing Rock was because of our many celebrity and non-native supporters. You know, we're so used to causes that matter to our tribes and our people where only other natives care about it, and people in power, people in positions of power, will only ever talk about those matters to natives. They won't talk about it to non-natives. Here, I think with certain politicians and then certainly the celebrity interest kind of sparked a media interest. How I got involved was I was working for the Seattle mayor at the time and a few other campaigns as well. And I started, Jody asked me to help get letters of support from non-tribal leaders. We had almost all of the tribal leaders writing letters of support, but we needed to show support from outside as well. So I was working with mayor's offices, governor's offices, congresspeople's office to write letters of support. And I think it really garnered a lot of media attention, so much so that the tribe got to a point where they couldn't handle it anymore because no tribe had ever had to deal with that kind of media attention. Typically if you look at Native Americans in the media, we get like one sad article about Pine Ridge per year, and that's pretty much it. But all of a sudden at Standing Rock, when I first went there, every major media outlet in the United States, many in England, many from around the world, are staying in Bismarck, staying at the casino, out there at camp, talking to people, trying to learn. And it was just really a phenomenal thing. And even nowadays, even though camp is done and we are moving on into the next phase of the movement, I still see more articles about Native Americans and other situations than I ever did before. So I think that it has seeded in these reporters and these media outlets an interest in maintaining a kind of relationship and a coverage that we didn't have before they went to Standing Rock or before they talked to natives. One of the things that we encountered, the tribe initially hired a communications firm. And we saw this in communications. We saw this with the tribal, well, not with the tribal attorneys, but with some of the contract attorneys, We had a lot of non-natives telling us how to talk and what to say. And a lot of times they would forget that, we don't always need to talk about Mother Earth and 7 generations. Sometimes we can speak as sovereign governments and speak in legal terms. We have a lot of non-Indians try to make us say statements like this and get very romantic and spiritual, and we need to be taken seriously as well. We can speak that language. We have hundreds of really successful Indian lawyers in this country. We've got people who can write extremely well. We don't always need to have other people telling us what to say and defining our narrative. And I think Standing Rock was one of the first occasions when the tribe had enough political power to really put their foot down and say, no, we're going to have natives controlling this narrative. So I went on contract to the tribe as a liaison to the, non-native communications firm that was hired to write for them. And I basically started writing most of our press releases and a lot of Chairman Archambault's letters. One of my favorite things, I write a lot of other stuff that gets credited to other people. But one of my favorite things I've ever written is Chairman Archambault's response letter to President Trump after he issued the executive memorandum, sending the pipeline forward. It was very fun to get to be formally angry. But so kind of harnessing those communications and saying, no, you don't need to speak to this romantic notion of what you think a Native American should be. No, you don't need to speak to a strictly non-Indian audience. You can combine those and speak to both and bring everybody to an understanding. And that's what Standing Rock did really well. Through their legal communications, through their communications with the media. And it was difficult at times because, we had a lot of people declaring themselves spokespersons for, what was happening at Standing Rock. And the truth is there's no one voice. I mean, the tribe wasn't completely in control of the camp. There were different groups in camp who were not in control of the camp. Everybody was just there with one goal being stop this pipeline, protect the water. It all came down to the water. So there are certain things that, the environmental groups could say that the tribe can't necessarily say, because the tribe, no matter what happened with the pipeline, 4 years from now, 10 years from now, they're still going to have a working relationship with the state of North Dakota. They're still going to have a working relationship with the federal government. So there are limits that you can push and relationships that you can test, but there's also a lot stricter boundaries with how you have to carry yourselves, because as chairman, Chairman Archambault had to worry about the lives of his citizens and prevent the next Sand Creek massacre. What the administration did really well was essentially stop the state of North Dakota from coming in and sweeping camp in August. We were able to carry it forward until the administration was finally pressured enough to change their decision. So that kind of balancing act and reshaping the narrative and really reclaiming it was, I think, one of the most significant achievements of Standing Rock's resistance. One that I hope that will continue to carry forward as we maintain these relationships with media. And also with the large number of non-Indian groups, whether they're environmental groups or celebrities or just a variety of different people who never paid any attention to natives before and now, kind of keep tabs on what's going on, asking for updates, what's going on at Standing Rock, where else, what's the next fight, what's the next battle. And the realization, too, by a lot of people that we don't always need other people to speak for us. We don't always have to hire non-natives. We've got enough brain power and enough brain trust to populate the administration, lobby for our people, represent our people, speak for our people, without having, we've got writers now, our own reporters, without having to rely on everybody else to tell our story and define that. And that's what was really, really different about Standing Rock. And I think it was all because of the kind of perfect political storm and the right people in the right place that understood that this was not just about, this wasn't solely about an achievement in resistance or an achievement in a new kind of protest movement. It was also an achievement in political strategy and maneuvering that they obviously underestimated the tribe for. Yeah, I guess I will just close out my part with saying that I think that another really great side effect of what's happened after Standing Rock, and Julian kind of touched on this, but we have by far a record number of natives running for office, and I think that that's for a variety of reasons. You know, there's the general, I don't know what what adjective is strong enough to use here, but unease after the last election and what's going on in our country right now. But I think a big part of it is the political empowerment that we saw in 2016 of natives and the frustration of not being represented and the realization that we can do something about that. So we've got faith, and we've got Deb Buchananoff in Washington State, Tim Ballou. I think we've got 11 in Montana. We've got Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids in Kansas running for Congress. Paulette Jordan running for governor of Idaho. Hundreds, Peggy Flanagan, lieutenant governor of Minnesota. And then hundreds of people running for state office just because they realize that that's where they need to be. And I'm really excited. I think Deb will probably make it. Paulette and Sharice have a good shot. And all these state offices, I think in South Dakota, we've got somebody running for Attorney General and somebody also running for Public Utilities Commission. Those offices matter. And more natives getting campaign experience so that we have a place on these campaigns because, you know, I've worked on 2 presidential campaigns and a bunch of smaller ones. Nobody goes looking for Native Americans to work on campaigns. You have to put yourself there. So.
Thank you. Nicole, can you pass down the mic to? Okay, thank you, Nicole, Willis. Thank you so much, and we'll come back to many of those issues that you raised, particularly about the different ways in which the Obama administration, but basically the different ways in which kind of the political establishment engages a protest movement like Standing Rock because of the sovereignty issues, in contrast to so many of the other movements of resistance that we've been studying this year. Jaskiran, Dhillon, do you want to comment?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's nice to see so many people in the room at the end of the semester. And I'd also like to give a shout out to all of my students. I taught a class here at Columbia in the fall semester, and I see some of my students here, so it's nice to see you here too. I'd also like to thank Bernard for inviting me to be part of the panel tonight, and to Anna for all of her work, and to the incredible co-panelists that I have the honor of sharing some space and time with tonight. So thank you, Leanne and Julian and Nicole, for your thoughtful comments and for setting us on a good path and thinking about the questions that are at the heart of tonight's discussion. So I have a couple things that I wanted to do. So I've been listening to the panelists speak, and so I'm going to offer a few comments that sort of come to mind as I was listening to them speak. And then I want to close out with a short piece that I've written about the Indigenous youth movement at Standing Rock, and sort of centering and grounding the work of the Standing Rock resistance in the work and mobilizing efforts of Indigenous youth, since they were very central to the movement there. So I guess I also wanted to acknowledge that we're here in Lenape-Hoking on the traditional territory of the Lenape people. So I wanted to start by saying a few words about both, I guess, all 3 presentations, but in particular, Leanne and Nicole's presentations made me think a lot about radical relationality and politicized allyship. So as Bernard mentioned in my bio, I grew up on Treaty 6 Cree territory, and also the homelands of the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada. And I was fortunate to have been raised in a household with a very politicized father. My parents were immigrants from northern India, and I was raised from a very young age with sort of an awareness that they had arrived and immigrated to Canada and landed on somebody else's homeland that was not the Canadian state. So throughout sort of most of my work, both as a thinker and writer and advocate, I've been really preoccupied with this sense of, as a settler of color, what is my responsibility to the native homelands that my parents built their home upon? How do I think about my relationship and sets of responsibilities to native people in both the Canada and the United States as I move back and forth across the border? How do we think with care and thought about the kinds of movements that we support? What are our political organizing strategies that are not sort of peripheral to questions of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, but actually place questions of Indigenous dispossession at the center of those movements? And how do we enact, again, like a kind of, what does our resistance or refusal look like as settlers? And for me, as a settler of color, what are the ways in which my actions, my everyday actions, and my larger set of political responsibilities to the communities that I feel accountability to, how do I think about questions of resistance, uprising, refusal as someone who lives on occupied territory and obviously participates in various ways in the reproduction of the states of both Canada and the United States, right? Our academic institutions are part of those structures. Most of our social institutions are part of those structures. The work that I have done in Western Canada with Indigenous youth clearly demonstrates the carceral logics of education, child welfare, and criminal justice systems. So we're all working in and around and through these institutions, and at the same time, Indigenous peoples continue to be dispossessed of their homelands, continue to live under egregious levels of state violence, continue to be undermined in their claims for territorial sovereignty and land reclamation projects and the reinstatement of Indigenous governance systems. So I'm really, I really think hard about these questions when I listen to you speak, when I listen to all three of you speak, and I hear, commentary about, as Native people, we can tell our own story. So then I think, what is my responsibility as a settler of color who lives on this land to engage in these questions and to really be thoughtful and deliberative about the kinds of actions that I take and the ways that I even conceptualize notions of resistance or alignment or relationality or, going to Standing Rock, for example, and supporting the resistance efforts there. And the next comment that I just want to make briefly is about, in response to Julian's presentation, which really made me think long and hard again about all of the work, that really critical and fundamental work that has to happen in the environmental justice movement. So Julian's presentation really brought home for me all the ways that Indigenous peoples continue to be tokenized and marginalized and sort of engaged in ways that refuse to center long-standing histories of oppression and dispossession. And I'm thinking here of the work, I read a really brilliant article and taught it in one of my classes last week by Lenape scholar Joanne Barker, and the article is excellent. It's called Territory as Analytic. It's about to come out in Social Texts, I believe. I would encourage everyone to read it. And there's a line in her article where she says, dispossession is foundational, it's not anecdotal. Right? So this kind of critique of the politics of inclusion and recognition that Glenn and Audra and Leanne and many others have offered, brilliant Indigenous writers and thinkers have offered, really, really is so important within the context of thinking about environmental justice. We can be participating in a protest against a pipeline and at the same time be undermining Indigenous movements for sovereignty and freedom and justice, right? So how are we ensuring that the ways in which we engage in questions of environmental justice are actually not reinscribing or reproducing sort of white the advancement of white settler civilization at the expense of Indigenous land reclamation and reinstatement of political governance systems and sort of eradication of colonial gender violence and all the things that we know continue to impact Native communities in such deep and profound ways. So I want to thank you for bringing that home so well, Julian. And so now I'm going to just quickly close because I only have 10 minutes with this short piece that I'm really thinking about the role of Indigenous youth and how they're so central to so much of what Leanne talked about in her talk tonight, and the sort of the embodiment of resurgence and refusal. So I'm going to just share this with you, and then I'll close out. And it's called Indigenous Youth, Standing Rock, and the Rise of Anti-Colonial Entropy. There's a scarcity of platforms that make space for Indigenous youth to represent themselves and speak back to the stories of risk and crisis that circulate about them. While Indigenous young people's lives are mediated by and through ongoing settler colonialism, to be sure, they also embody and demonstrate tremendous strength and political resistance in their everyday existence, an ingenuity and creative opposition to structural violence that often goes unnoticed or is tactically downplayed by the settler state and colonial media representations of them and their communities. Situated at the intersection of precarity and possibility, Indigenous youth are makers of something I'm beginning to interpret as anti-colonial entropy, a networked set of ideas, beliefs, and organizing efforts crucial to fostering a political condition of decolonial disorder in our current reality of racial capitalism, violent state sovereignty, and a persistent avowal of present future where white settler power reigns supreme. One of the instances where this anti-colonial entropy could be witnessed was in the Standing Rock Sioux's struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline. The ecologies of decolonial organizing, the political strategies Indigenous youth deployed to produce chaos and disorder in the colonial present were many, but a few stood out to me as especially noteworthy as I watched the mobilization against DAPL unfold. First, Indigenous youth organizing at Standing Rock involved bringing subjugated knowledges forward and elevating silenced narratives about contemporary Native life. Erin Weiss, a prominent youth organizer at Standing Rock, explained the importance of lifting up these perspectives in an interview with the New York Times, where she remarked, quote, "No one realizes what the repercussions of colonization have been, the repercussions of forced removal," end quote. In a similar vein, youth organizer Zaisha Grinnell explained to me that, quote, "Native women and girls are put into an even more risky position because of the extractive industries, and this is part of how Native peoples have been treated for a long time in this country. I learned this from my dad and my grandma. It was passed down," end quote. Through a constellation of decolonial counterscripts, Indigenous youth consistently demonstrated that the struggle against DAPL was also a struggle against the violent materialism of what it means to live and breathe, to exist within colonial systems and structures, that these experiences are intergenerational, moving back and forth in time. Importantly, this resurrection of colonial history, as explained by youth like Wise and Grinnell, initiates a direct confrontation with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's depiction of the United States as a country founded through genocide and land theft. Next, Indigenous young people embodied ways of being in relation to one another as humans existing amongst and within an other than human world, through their embodied actions of living in ceremony in the resistance camps, which took the form of prayer, feeding the sacred fire, collective walks in honor of the sacredness of the land, water, and air, and holding water ceremonies. Indigenous youth reframe this battle as a battle for an ethics of living that gives equal weight to human and other human relations, including plants, animals, elemental forces, and the cosmos as constituents of a collective whole. They positioned water as kinship instead of resource, and in doing so, explicitly challenged the human nature dualism that has marked notions of civilization and progress since the colonial founding of the United States. This too serves as a fundamental challenge to colonial relations of domination. And third, Indigenous young people at Standing Rock were demanding a future that is accountable to them and generations yet to be born. They made it clear that silence and complicity are no longer and never have been acceptable in the face of such violence. This sentiment was beautifully captured in an interview I conducted with LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, founder of the Sacred Stone Camp. When I asked her about the role of youth at Standing Rock, she told me, quote, "When things started happening against DAPL, it was the youth who ran the chants, the youth who ran the marches, and the youth that followed. We have to listen to them. They are fighting for their right to live. They are fighting for the right to have water. They are fighting for their future. They are fighting for their children, for what comes next. I believe these young people stood up to heal a nation, and that's what I see them doing. So it is and has always been them and their words. There is power in these youth. There is prayer and ceremony in what they speak. When they speak the truth," end quote. Indigenous youth organizing and political mobilization at Standing Rock can be read as stories of refusal, self-affirmation, and strategic resistance to colonial power, all of which fuel decolonial disorder and disorganization in the colonial machinery that sustains the status quo and promotes business as usual. They are at the forefront of educating and supporting their communities, as well as the public sphere, and transcending key sites of colonial trauma and violence. And more than that, they help us to decipher what it means to be an Indigenous young person growing up in occupied United States, assert priorities for decolonization, and in them and in the everyday, and map stories and lived experiences that chart the ways that Indigenous young people are already actively working towards transforming their own futures and the futures of their communities. To put it succinctly, Indigenous youth are the critical mass threading together and sustaining the anti-colonial entropy necessary for revolutionary liberation that will bring forth alternative forms of existence on the planet. In doing so, the bravery and brilliance of these young people should compel all of us to ask ourselves what we are willing to fight for.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaskiran. Okay, so we have a few questions on the table, thanks to Jaskiran Dhillon's comments. And I thought I was going to, I'd just put a few other ones on the table as well. And then maybe what we could do is open it up. I mean, we've got so many brilliant students here, so maybe we'll open it up to a few voices and then get some responses and then go back and get more comments and responses, okay? So what I heard, so there were a few things in Jaskiran's comments. One about this notion of radical relationality that might be something that we can explore a little bit more. I'll pick up on that. There was also the question of the relationship to the environmental justice movement, which is very important and we need to address as well. And Julian had kind of touched on that, so that would be something to think about. Now, I was particularly taken by this idea of embedded theory, that Leanne, that you kind of kicked us off with. The idea of somehow theorizing in a situation, in a lived situation, in a rich context where we're not drawing distinctions between, I don't know, the more traditional Western philosophical traditions that separate away logic and mentality from the relational, from the stories that we're saying, from the practices, from the oral traditions, and from relations that would be more embedded in our practices. So that was something that really interested me to think about, to start thinking about. And the two concepts that seemed to dominate a lot of the presentations were the concept of refusal on the one hand and relationality on the other. And so I was wondering about the tension between those two, between refusal versus relationality. If there is a tension, I mean, I can see ways in which there might be a tension. I can also see ways in which the tension might be resolved. But there could be an obvious tension in the sense that refusal can consist in a form of separation, in a form of demarcation, maybe in a form of isolation, that would involve a non-relationality, or that might, and you know, this might be a direction to go in, might mean a different kind of relationality, built first on theories of refusal. And then another kind of issue on the topic on the table has to do with the question of refusal as a double negative, which was something that was raised in the presentations. Refusal as then a double negative that one assents to something, and some of the proposals of what you are assenting to, I think was, if I recall correctly, well, there was notions of relations actually there, and also notions of relations to land, say. But does refusal necessarily mean assenting to something, or is that a flip? Are these flip sides of the coin, or not? Or can you have productive refusal that doesn't have that flip side? Okay, so those were some thoughts I had, but I want to hear from others, and I want to hear from others as to how, is it some thoughts, some questions, some... All right, so I'm going to pass the mic around, but all you do is raise your hand and the mic is yours, okay?
Thank you to all of our panelists. I just wanted to ask about some of the challenges with some of the post-Standing Rock sort of engagement, you know, the political engagement, the media engagement, and, you know, there's this, you know, the notion that there's sort of the power of Standing Rock is the assertion of sovereignty and refusal, and then, you know, the act of going into politics or engaging with the media, in many ways, you know, there's sort of an exposure to the, you know, the prevailing culture in the United States, and, you know, act of running for office is almost you're appealing to, you know, citizens, and so I was just interested in how, you know, you can carry forward the sort of the sovereignty and the notion of being sort of an authentic self when you run for office and you're sort of in that process of appealing to others. So I was just interested in you know, how you can maintain that.
Thank you. It was really tremendous. It was fantastic. I was wondering, you are all kind of political activists, and I guess you are defending some idealistic vision of the future. And I was wondering, in this vision, what is the right relation between the settlers and the native people of America? What to you is the right equilibrium that could be found? What's your opinion on mixing? Are you not afraid that your culture could disappear because of marriage and not because of force or because of the law? And maybe it will never come true, but what is your idealistic vision of the relation? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Monica. It's nice to see you guys again, some of you. One question I have is kind of comes off like a feeling I have, like a frustration with like American politics is kind of like the futility of it, especially with like Native issues, like with Standing Rock and a lot of other, like every other issue that involves Native people. We can put ourselves in these positions of like trying to get political legitimacy, but the results just aren't happening. And even if we do put ourselves in these positions of power in politics, and since like we'll never win the numbers game, they say, like how do we like build these coalitions, and like how do we gain this political legitimacy in this system that doesn't work for us, that wasn't built for us? And what is the mission of gaining this political legitimacy while also rebuilding our own nations? And how do you foresee that like process going about?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure about a question, but I did want to say that we're here from Puerto Rico, and hearing you folks speak, it's remarkable how many parallels there are, thinking about not in terms of the resistance per se, but in terms of the hurricane and finally Puerto Rico being news and what that feels like to be on a front page without necessarily being in control of a narrative. And I really appreciated the discussion, or the way that you prefaced the start of your talk, Leanne, with our survival and our even just being here today, meaning that there has been a resistance for centuries. And I'm really interested in that piece, maybe thinking a bit more about problematizing the chronology of whether we're winning or losing, and thinking about resistance from that place. And if you folks could speak more, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about that, different nonlinear understanding of resistance and transformation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so we've got a number of issues on the table. Who wants to kick us off with some thoughts? You do? Nicole, why don't you kick us off then? Because there were some that were directed at you.
Okay, so a couple of these are certainly tied together. Monica's question, the futility of national politics, also ties into your question about what the end goal is. From all of my years of working in politics, the most common end goal is complete autonomy for tribal nations. A lot of tribal leaders don't really know how to articulate that because the complex federal-tribal relationship is so hard to understand. But nobody wants to have to get permission from the federal government to do anything. Nobody wants to be forced to grant the federal government permission to do anything. And while we are tied to them financially right now, we know that that's not an ideal future. And so maintaining jurisdiction and borders and being allowed to preserve our cultural identity while functioning as autonomous nations within the United States, I would say, is the most common goal of tribal nations. That ties into, Monica's question about the futility of national politics. And it's a slow trickle. I mean, we made a lot of progress in the Obama administration. I know to the average person, it may not feel like a lot, but there were certain things that got done that were opening the path forward towards that autonomy. The biggest one being restoring criminal jurisdiction over some violent offenders on Indian reservations, because obviously we can't function as autonomous nations if we're not permitted to protect our people or visitors to the reservation. So that was a big step forward, and that one's been left alone by this administration thus far. But certainly, we're seeing steps backwards in other areas, and it's going to be, unless we get some fantastic politician who is just willing to kind of hand over the reins when it comes to Indian country and willing to experiment and take a chance, it's going to be a slow trickle, and changing those laws and allowing for greater autonomy and greater economic freedom to develop economic opportunity on the reservation so that we don't feel forced to be reliant on the federal government. And a lot of that comes from healing within our own communities and learning to prioritize what will best enable us to reach that future with or without the United States backing us. So essentially learning to behave as nations when nationhood is not quite yet achieved, according to Western definition of strict boundaries and territories and everything. I'll speak a little bit to your question with regards to keeping the movement going with respect to being tied to a sovereign government. What essentially happened at Standing Rock is that the community felt very burdened by the camp towards the end. And so when the next election cycle came around, they voted for a candidate who wanted to kind of disengage from the national conversation and just focus inward, which is their every right. Ideally, I would have liked them to do both, just because I think that Standing Rock was such a beacon of strength and hope for so many people that it would have been nice if they had stayed a little bit more engaged. But you can't expect that of any one nation, and it's a lot of pressure. It was a lot of work, and there was a lot of focus taken away from the health of their own community to focus on this global struggle. So I think the key is to engage more sovereign nations going forward, and certainly to identify those in which leaders, are more willing to be a part of that. We're seeing a lot more younger tribal leaders who are a little bit more progressive, who see the value in those kind of relationships. But just as with the U.S. government, it's always going to be in flux. Who's going to be more engaged? So I think just kind of maintaining like a good visual of the playing field of kind of the progressive nations who are kind of consistently willing to be on top of these issues. Right now we see the Puyallup in Washington State fighting the liquefied natural gas plant. They're doing a great job of being really engaged with media. And, we've got a number of other fights that Julian highlighted throughout the continent that, are really moving forward in that respect.
Thank you, Nicole. Who's next?
Yeah, I think one tension that I think animates a bit of what I had to say, and myself personally, I live in Washington, D.C. I advocate, Congress people for some of the issues that I highlighted. Is this tension about when you engage the institutions, the powers that be, the state, and when you choose not to, and when you choose to reaffirm what came before, which was our sovereignty, our political communities, our nations. And I think that there is a tension there. I don't think that it can all be captured in this notion of refusal. I think some of the folks who I highlighted in my story, Faith Spotted Eagle, for example, is on the one hand, she convened the meeting on the Lower Brule Reservation. She's one of the folks right now on the ground who's helping to lead the fight against Keystone XL. At the same time, she's campaigning to be in the state legislature in South Dakota. And this is one person who's taking both of those political actions, that they're in the same frame. When I was in graduate school, I happened to come across the dissertation of a Maori feminist scholar and historian named Aroha Harris. Aroha means love. And she had this really wonderful phrase to explain the ways that Maori and Aotearoa, or New Zealand, had chosen to very effectively, I think, to Nicole's presentation, engage the state in some ways to advocate for autonomy, to advocate for their rights, to advocate even for sovereignty, and sometimes to withdraw and to like reaffirm their own political communities. She described this as a dance with the state, as someone who dances, as someone who talked a little bit about dancing in my presentation. I think that way of thinking about it as like, with a partner or with this institution that has been built on our homelands, when do we choose to engage and when do we choose to turn away? And I think it's quite complicated. I don't think that I can come up with some sort of categorical imperative about when we should be working with these institutions and when we shouldn't. And I think to the point of Coulthard's scholarship, there are instances of us engaging in these institutions that in the longer term have perhaps undermined our ability to articulate more powerful, equal futures. So.
So I was thinking, often when I'm reading the work of Glenn or Audra, I sort of take these ideas of refusal and then go back into Anishinaabe thought and try to relate to them through that way. And so one of the ways I was thinking through the idea of refusal was through Anishinaabe storytelling. And we have a story that I used to tell my kids when they were little because they're part of the deer clan, about the relationship between the Anishinaabe and deer in our territory. And there was a time, the story goes, that the Anishinaabe were abusing the deer, that we were hunting too much, that we weren't showing the deer respect. And so the deer refused that relationship with the Anishinaabe, and they left the territory. They went north. At first, the Anishinaabe didn't notice. And then as time went on, we missed our relative, and we missed that relationship. So we sent people out in all of the directions looking for those deer. Eventually, we found them in the north, and they were not happy with us. And so we sent a delegation to meet with them. And over several days, they came to an understanding, several days of the Anishinaabe listening, and then making moves to regenerate the relationship and restore the relationship. The deer agreed to come back. And so there's a series of practices that we do when we go hunting that involves asking a deer to give up their life so that we can feed our family. There is a series of practices we have when we've killed a deer in terms of sharing, using everything that we take. When the deer are having difficult times, we rely on other food. So this, to me, is an example of a refusal in the context of a highly relational nation in a highly relational world. So what it tells me is that I always have the right to refuse a relationship, that actually in order for a relationship to work in a way that's beneficial, you need my consent. And so I think those kinds of foundations then create kind of a robust series of relationships across time and space where if there's shifts or if there's refusals, then things have to be rebalanced and regenerated. So there's also a lot of stories about one of our sort of trickster characters who doesn't refuse capitalism, who is always constantly kind of hoarding food or collecting up goods, trying to get other folks to do their work. And it always ends in disaster. And so I think there's lots of, or that's sort of for me a source of, or a way of thinking kind of through with my ancestors, these ideas of refusal within the context of relationality. I wanted to respond to that allyship question because I think that's a really interesting question that I've been thinking about in the wake of Idle No More. So during Idle No More, which was for Indigenous people in Canada, probably one of our last big mobilizations in terms of having people mobilized from across the country. And there was so many discussions during that about, in terms of tactics and strategies based on the response of white people. Oh, we can't do that because then we'll upset the white people, or then they're not going to support us. And so all of our actions and a lot of our conversations were geared towards what was palatable to a white audience. And I think in the wake of that, I've thought a lot about, again, going with inside Anishinaabe thought, going with inside that grounded normativity that Kothar talks about. What are my responsibilities locally and internationally to other peoples in my territory? And so living on the North Shore of Lake Ontario, we've had Black people in our territory for 400 years. So am I a good ally to them? Am I acting in solidarity with them? Are we mobilized to the degree that we should be when they are mobilized? How am I acting in solidarity, and what are my ethical responsibilities to that community, for instance, within grounded normativity? Now that Black Lives Matters is mobilized, and I don't know more in my part of the world is not so mobilized. What I'm seeing on the ground is an interesting solidarity where after, in the wake of the Colton Bushy verdict, the Indigenous community was mobilized in Toronto at a vigil, and Black Lives Matters provided a lot of material support in terms of microphones, sound systems, security, to enable our community to grieve. And so that, to me, was very, very productive. And I think the white allies who got it and who are good allies were there anyway, even though nobody was catering to them. So I'm interested, I think, in thinking through that from within Anishinaabe thought and developing those kind of on the ground relationships. I think the last thing that I wanted to just touch on was that generations of resistance, because I think as a youth activist, I thought as sometimes you do in your youth, that you're the first person that's ever noticed the injustice, and this is the first time that you've ever mobilized. And so for me, it was really great to start to shift the thinking on that and to recognize that, well, wait a minute, there have been generations of people in my family and in my community and in my nation that have been resisting in all kinds of ways outside of protest and outside of a visible physical mobilization to make sure that that we're still here. And what does it take to sustain that kind of resistance over 4 centuries? You're going to have highs, you're going to have lows, you're going to have times when you're visible, you're going to have times when it's not visible. So thinking about it over that kind of long term, and then how do we make sure in our mobilizations that we're one of my elders talked about resistance being like throwing a rock into the water, and you see those concentric circles of influence moving out across time and space. So how are we, what we're doing today, how is that influencing things internationally and through time? And so I think it's really important, and this is part of the reason why I'm engaged in the arts now, to make spaces where we can feel the successes and where Indigenous joy and celebration as part of our relationality and part of our mobilizations. I think that's a really, really important part of sustaining.
Thank you. Jaskiran, do you have any thoughts that you want to add? Yeah, we can open it up. Okay. Yeah. So no, I really appreciated those thoughts about refusal and relationality. So that's really helpful. So I suppose the model would be something like kind of interjecting. I mean, refusal as something one interjects in the process of thinking through relationality, right? I mean, at least it sounded that way in the story, that like one interjects moments of refusal as because the relations aren't sufficiently respectful or balanced or something like that, and so one is working on relationality, but through this device. At least that's how I kind of am processing it or thinking about it, which I think is helpful. I mean, I was originally thinking of something more static, where refusal would then restructure relations. But I see this as being more of a kind of a cycle, maybe, such that relations are built properly, but in a way in which kind of, there are certain limits that are posed.
I think though in a relational sort of nationhood, those relationships are constantly cycled and constantly ongoing, and so they need to be continually kind of nurtured. So that you see in a treaty process, I think that would have been our original intent. It wasn't about a land transaction or a piece of paper. It was about that continual relationship. And I think that in my culture, my personal understanding is that I give as much as I can to the land and to my family and to the struggle. Where I employ a refusal is when that giving then takes away from the essence of me. So if I'm in a system like colonialism that's out to destroy me, then I have to refuse in order to preserve those other relationships of intimacy and love.
And can I ask one question about kind of decision making, right? So at Standing Rock. So I mean, we've looked at other forms of, other forms of resistance that sometimes look similar, like Occupy Wall Street in terms of a different kind of encampment. And I was saying settlement is different than occupation, et cetera. And then one sees their models of, the General Assembly and other forms of decision-making arising. But I take it here we're in a context where there's a sovereign nation and there are elected chief and representative relations. So what is the model of decision-making that was operative, say, at Standing Rock or in a context like this?
So I guess I'd say the model of decision-making was kind of in constant evolution. In the beginning, when camp was smaller and the weather was nice, things went a lot smoother. When tensions with law enforcement started getting higher and there were more nonviolent direct actions that were resulting in arrest or violence, the tribe came in and said, as a sovereign, they needed to protect people, to protect their tribal members and their visitors, and asked, please don't try and get arrested. Please don't try to incite violence. But there were people there who wanted that because they thought that a greater action would cause a greater reaction. So there were definitely people there that disagreed with the tribe's stance on, nonviolence and please don't try to get arrested, because the North Dakota law enforcement and the private security were waiting to lose it. I mean, if you saw the footage of them, they loved it when they got to be violent and act crazy. And some people wanted to engage in that, hoping that it would blow up the cause even bigger. But the tribe, having to be responsible for their citizens and for people on their land, could not condone that. So there were times when certain groups were, I don't want to say disciplined, because for non-tribal members who are just visiting, there's not really anything you can do other than say, hey, please don't do that. But it was definitely made clear at certain times that this is not the direction we want this to go, because safety is paramount. But for the most part, decision-making was made by the individual camps and the groups within the camps. The camp was very organized. If you look at a map, a lot of people were organized by tribe, where they were from or from different societies. And towards the final stages of camp, a lot of people from the Acheti-Shakolian tribes tried to come together and install a traditional form of kind of camp governance for the main camp, which they called the Horn, that a lot of people respected, but at that point, camp was 10,000 people, so it's a lot of people to be in charge of.
Right. Okay. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I can add to Nicole's point just more broadly. I think in the history of Indigenous social movements and long before, I think there's a long-standing tension between who represents and gets to speak for the people. What is the government entity, traditional or recognized by the state or otherwise, that has the authority to speak on behalf of the first people of this particular land? To make it even more complicated, like, is it the government of a particular reservation or reserve community, or is it a conglomeration of people who come from the same relations of nations, et cetera? These are questions that have played out across Indian country for decades and centuries. They're constantly in tension. My own people have there was this thing called the Gustafson Lake standoff in the 1990s. It was fairly prominent. It escalated into an armed standoff between the Canadian military and people, including some of our own people, who were occupying or reoccupying and reclaiming land near our reserve. And there was a tension between, I think actually quite similar to Standing Rock, between the elected band council that had a responsibility to maintain a nonviolent relationship with the nearest settlement, the town of 100 Mile House, which is kind of in what would be considered maybe like the deep north of Canada. This is not liberal, nice Canada that you might think of. This is a different part of the country. And the group of activists, more radical actors who were out on the land reclaiming territory on behalf of more traditional forms of governance. I think that this question of like who gets to represent the First Peoples is one of the most important ones of the sort of movements of self-determination. And I think it's constantly not fully resolved. Should it be elected band councils who are ostensibly elected through democratic processes? Should it be more traditional forms of clan governance, et cetera? And I think part of this set of questions, right, and this plays out throughout places where we think about self-determination, is that sorting through those problems is actually part of the work of this politics. It's giving people the space to actually, instead of dealing with the latest incursion on their homelands, having the opportunity actually to engage in those fundamental questions of how we will organize ourselves politically in relation to each other and to others. That's just one of the ways that politics operates everywhere.
Go ahead, Nicole. Yeah.
Something I was going to mention earlier that ties into this really well too is I think a lesson that I don't know that the media learned this lesson, but I think the tribe and a lot of other organizations that were at camp learned this lesson, that because the media is so not used to working with natives, they never question who they're talking to or what that person represents or where they come from. It's like these reporters would walk into camp and ask, Karen from Burning Man, like, what's the tribe doing now? And then they print it. It's like, just because you're uneasy and you don't know doesn't mean you can't ask, Like, do some research and fact check and find out who are some good people you should be talking to. It's not only going to be the tribal government. There's a lot of people who have important things to say. But fact check. Like, you would do that in any other community. So just because you're not used to working with natives doesn't mean you shouldn't do it there.
Thanks. Julie Livingston?
Thank you all. This has been an absolutely fantastic panel. And I'll preface my question by saying that I work in Botswana, where issues in the Kalahari among indigenous people who've been through multiple waves of settler colonialism by Africans and then by white settlers resonate in many ways with some of what you've described, including some of the metaphysics and systems of thought that you've presented. And I'm curious about this entity that that you've only talked about kind of peripherally so far, and how it fits into the politics that you're talking about, because maybe it forms the connective tissue to, you raised the Maori author that you were talking about, or some of the people in Southern Africa, or what have you, and that is the Energy Corporation. So far we've been talking about state or nation politics, but the many-headed hydra of the energy or the mining corporation that pops up in each of these places, I wonder if you could just comment on what that adds to or takes away from, or how you address that figure within the questions of sovereignty that you've raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Salvasha?
Hi, thank you so much for what's been a phenomenal panel. My question simply is, it's a request if you could please shed some light on what happens when relational, this radical relationality has to be made legible to Western epistemologies, and also when it has to confront the carceral logic of the state. Jessica mentioned, I'm actually just borrowing your phrase, carceral logics of education, welfare, and the criminal justice system, and what kind of confrontation that looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavesh. Yes, can you grab that mic? And I've got Shai and then Daniele. Make sure, to turn it on.
Thanks for a fantastic panel. My question is about being an ally. So more to Leanne's comments and Jaskiran, you also mentioned it, but also to problematize the concept. So Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, in a different context of prison abolition and race relations in the U.S., she critiques the concept of being an ally, and that an ally is going to a campaign and it has an end date. So there's the temporal relation to being an ally. And so famously in Standing Rock, there's this image of the U.S. ex-military people coming to ask for forgiveness, which was to the regular American audience, the settler audience, this was shocking, but other people critique this as, okay, you come ask for forgiveness, but you continue to enjoy the actual dispossession that the U.S. military has caused, that you, not maybe personally, but enjoy the structures that are still in place after Standing Rock, regardless of the consequence. And so now Glenn Coulthard, in his book, discusses maybe a competing concept to being an ally, which is decolonial subjectivity. So Glenn talks about Native American and First Nation decolonial subjectivity, but I wonder what you would think of using that as an alternative mechanism to thinking about how people can engage in a decolonial struggle together.
Thank you, Shai. Daniele?
Thank you so much for this terrific panel. So I guess that my question is revolves around the problem of translation, which has already been brought out, and especially what Leanne was referring to, about the invisible ordinary resistance that was in place for hundreds of years, and not only. So my question is about how your work, specifically as artists, writers, connects with this necessity to and effort to translate in some sense and to make visible something that might be even harder to see than the Standing Rock, something that is more ordinary, that is more fundamental and basic, and how you see your work also drawing from that, and how you see the two communicate one to the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Anybody else want in at this point? We got a few questions on the table. We could fit another one. Yes. Let me give you the mic. Hold on.
Thanks once again, all of you, for a great panel. As a reporter that covers immigration, I've been trying to figure out or kind of understand the relationship between the immigrants' rights movement with the indigenous movements here in North America. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on sort of the interconnections between both movements. And I'm particularly interested in kind of exploring the idea of enforcing indigenous borders as a way to supersede, the federal government of the United States when it comes to immigration policy. Or if there's, probably not going to happen, right? The U.S. government would not allow it to happen. But sort of just even a theoretical framework as to how these two movements can work together and in what ways they overlap.
All right, so Who wants to kick off? Yeah, you want to start?
I'll try anyway.
Okay.
I'll make an attempt. So I guess I'll start with just sort of thinking in response to the questions about radical relationality and the questions of sort of allyship that have been raised. So for the first question about what happens when radical relationality needs to be legible to the state, I guess I'm not sure why it needs to be legible to the state. Maybe the whole point is that it is not legible to the state. Maybe developing radical relationality means that you're thinking outside of the constraints of participation and collaboration and relationship building that are determined by colonial relations of domination. And this actually relates back to the question about what does a settler indigenous relationship look like if we're imagining this kind of what you phrased as an idealistic future. I think this is about remembering that treaties are living relationships. And I'm thinking here about the work of Heidi Stark and others who remind us that a treaty relationship is not a one-sided relationship. And it's often indigenous people and their accomplices who are asked this question of what does it look like in a land where indigenous governance and political authority and land reclamation has been reinstated. And I feel like the answer to a lot of those questions are in treaties. They're in the negotiations. I mean, treaties aren't the answer entirely, but there were negotiations that were made around what it means to live, to coexist in a space. And all of those relationships and all of those treaties were broken time and time again and violated and continue to be violated in numerous ways. And I'm reminded here of my good friend Nick Estes, who also gets asked this question, and his response is often, what are you doing to think about the way in which you uphold your end of the treaty relationship? So that is part of the way I think we can begin to think about what it means to engage, I'm trying to circulate back, to engage and develop a decolonial subjectivity. And when I say allyship, I mean politicized allyship. I mean a kind of relationship building that withstands time, that takes care, that thinks a lot about decision-making authority and leadership and who you take that leadership from, how you understand your own place on the land in which you live and reside. So all of those things are about the development of a decolonial subjectivity. And I think, one can sort of wordsmith around accomplice building, allyship, politicized allyship, or decolonial subjectivity. But what really matters is what you do, how you live in the everyday in relationship to indigenous communities and their struggles for sovereignty and self-determination, which take myriad forms, right, depending on the space that you're in.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I've got you. Go. Okay, yeah, we'll come back this way.
I would just add on to that by providing an example of when radical relationality, allyship not translating to the outside world fails. When Energy Transfer Partners filed a frivolous lawsuit against Earth Justice and Greenpeace and a variety of other environmental organizations, basically accusing them of orchestrating camp and the tribe's actions against them. I was like, how dare you diminish what the tribe accomplished and what all of these indigenous people have come together to fight against, and give all the credit to the non-Indian environmental organizations. So that's an example, like this tribe issued a strong statement on that, saying in no way are we under the power, under the spell of the environmental organizations, I think is what the lawsuit actually said. But it would have been nice had those organizations backed us up and maybe in their activity could have translated that a little bit better, for the government's sake, so that they give the tribe the credit where it's due. And the truth of the matter is some of those organizations that were named in the lawsuit, while they didn't orchestrate or, put a spell on the tribe, they certainly enjoyed the boost that they got off of the media attention on the tribe.
Yeah. So I'm going to put I'm a wonk by day. I'm going to put my wonk hat on to answer the energy corporation and then the immigration questions. Then I'm going to take it off, and I'm going to answer the translation question. So on the energy corporation question, I was actually in this very room in the fall for a conversation about what the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights should be putting into its general comment on land rights. I think that the most immediate, obvious, policy thing that people advocate for is FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. This is the United Nations international standard. It's what every state should be doing, but basically no state is doing it. I think that there's also some models of indigenous jurisdiction and regulatory power that exist in places like the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, and that are actually being strengthened right now. There's a NDP Green coalition government that is in charge of barely the province there. And so there's actually opportunities in the coming months that I'm aware of for them to strengthen First Nations regulatory power over mines, which is actually pretty exciting stuff, in my opinion. As for the immigration question, there was a really interesting essay in The Guardian about essentially the idea of sanctuary tribal nations, and it is a thing that kind of made the rounds on Indigenous Twitter, which is in fact a thing, a few weeks ago. And I think that, if nothing else, as a way to get the messaging out there on native sovereignty, native jurisdiction issues in the US, which is so difficult to do because people are working from nothing. People don't know anything about these issues. I really like that idea. So to answer that question, I'm fully in favor of sanctuary tribal nations. Now to take the NoiseCat off, put it over here. On the question of translation, I'm recalled to two things. The first is a few summers ago, I was sitting in my Kia'a's living room on my Kia'a's my grandmother on the Canham Lake Reserve, and we were translating these oral histories that were delivered in Secwepemc, our Secwepemc language, of which she is one of only 3 remaining speakers on our reserve. And there was a way in which, and that all fits within a broader context of there are no treaties in the province that we come from. We are in ongoing negotiations to strengthen our rights and title to our lands. And so these can become then sources that can be introduced into that process, evidence, if you will. There was a way in which she engaged with the language. She took pleasure in the way, in hearing the way that the older people who had passed on spoke the language, that I think was a deeper translation, much deeper translation than what ending up on the paper. There was a pleasure in hearing the rhythm, the phonology of the way the language was spoken that is lost to everybody else except for her and me, who were sitting there and experiencing that. So I think that there's actually, it's not just simply translation, but there are levels to this. I experienced this myself as a writer and a journalist. Part of what I do is translate these issues for a broader public. But I think as I try to get better at this, and I'm obviously quite young, so I'm still learning, there are ways in which you can tell stories that some people will get it on one level, and then hopefully, if you do it well, your people or people who are in the know will get it on a deeper level, on a level that other folks could never get it. So I think that's how I would sort of problematize that question. There's what's the basic bullet points, and then there's what's the insider knowledge, what's the little pleasures of the story or the translation that other people could never understand.
I just wanted to pick up on that as well. within Indigenous thought, our stories and our theory are very layered and very coded. And that's something that I think is really important, because the sharing of that in the context of settler colonialism is something that's not safe, and it's not just not safe, that a lot of damage has been caused. Our knowledge is sort of regularly used against us. So I think people have to be really careful with what they share and how they share it. I think in my own work, that's something that I've had to wrestle with, because I want to make these kind of theoretical interventions based on Anishinaabe thought, and there's so little Anishinaabe thought in the academic record. And because our experts are elders who are out on the land, who are speaking the language and who are living that language, and so they're not in the academy. So one of the things that, for me, and I quit a tenure track position 18 years ago to sort of base my practice in community. And one of the things that's come out of that is sort of these close relationships where I'm having conversations about this with the knowledge holders themselves. And so in this book, I have a story about the origin of maple syrup. And that's a really, really old story in the context of my nation. And it's a story like the deer story that someone might share to answer a question. But it would be shared in the language, and it would be shared in a kind of a non-performative way, kind of between individuals. And it might be modified depending on the context of the relationship. So it might be different when different people share it. And the one thing that our knowledge holders would never do is what I did in the book, which is take 30 more pages to explain the theory behind it. And that was something that I did deliberately and in consultation with elders, because no one was getting it. When people would hear that story, they would assume it's a children's story, or it's a cute legend, or a nice myth, or some lore, but that the intellectual weight would be erased. And so I think in my work, I've thought a lot about how to code things, how to layer things, and what to make visible and what not to make visible. And those are kind of ethical collective decisions. Those aren't really my decisions to make. And how to have, I guess, an opaqueness, so that I can speak to my people and to people in the know through the work with minimizing the harm that translation can cause.
Thank you, Leanne. So we have just a few moments left, and I don't know, and we've spoken a lot. Maybe there are some final lingering thoughts that you may have. You've got something? Yeah? Okay, why don't you pass that down?
Just on the immigration question, I just wanted to refer you to the work of the Red Nation, because there was a pretty large mobilization that happened at LAX airport around the rise of when there were the initial deportation announcements that were made by the Trump administration, and there was a protest at LAX, and a lot of Indigenous folks showed up. And the sort of hashtag no ban on stolen land kind of emerged from that mobilization at LAX, which was really an Indigenous mobilization supporting all of the people that are working hard on the deportation issues that are so prevalent in the United States right now. So I think, and I can speak to just the sanctuary movement and how it's evolving at the New School, I think there is a growing conversation between immigrant rights movements, questions of deportation, and Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. And there is an article that was written by some of the members of the Red Nation that you can find on their website that speaks directly to this, so that might be a starting point for you to check out.
Great. Thank you so much. Final thoughts?
I guess I would just say, as a final thought, I keep forgetting I didn't answer this portion of Monica's question about how to change things. I mentioned that it was a slow trickle, but in my experience, we certainly need activism. We certainly need broad support. We certainly need that media attention. But what we need from natives, from our youth, from our leadership, is we also need insiders. So I can't stress enough like how much working on a campaign and becoming a political insider makes a difference, because while everybody else is forgetting about us and not paying attention to us, you can quietly work on, you know, what you think is going to really help our communities. Working on campaigns, working in the government, working in Congress, all of those things matter a lot. One other thing that I'll end with this is that I saw Mary Catherine Nagel's play Sovereignty a couple months ago, and in it, they're talking about the forced removal of the Cherokee, and Andrew Jackson says, you know, I have to do it. It was a campaign promise. Most of the things Obama did while he was in office that benefited Native Americans were campaign promises. And nobody was really paying attention when, you know, staff was in Chicago making these campaign promises, signing off on them. But years later, they were executed. And so that just goes to show like how much just having a presence and really focusing on that can really matter and turn into actual change. And we need more people doing that. There are not enough natives working on campaigns or, you know, going into politics. So.
Thank you, Nicole. Julian, a last thought, or?
Yeah, I guess I just want to emphasize Nicole's point. You know, Jody Gillette is a friend of myself and my family, and has been doing really amazing work. I think one thought that I really want to end with is that we, and by we I mean the people who have come on the land after us, have gotten so used to Native people losing to Indigenous defeat. It's almost like an assumed thing that we're just going to lose. I think that there are really remarkable organizers, activists, people playing the inside-outside game across Indian country in both the United States and Canada. And I think if there's one thing that we can all do to sort of support those people who are doing remarkable work, is to stop assuming that Native people are just going to continue to lose. So thank you all for coming tonight.
I think that's an amazing ending, actually. We will win. Thank you all for your deep engagement with the work tonight and with our talks. And thanks to Jas and Nicole and Julian for being here and presenting such amazing, diverse experiences and knowledge. And I'm going to remember Karen from Burning Man for a really long time. Oh my gosh.
All right, and we are going to end with another artwork by Leanne Simpson called How to Steal a Canoe. Can someone hit the lights in the back? They're on the wall over there, please.
Quiet is barefoot on the cement floor, singing to a warehouse of stolen canoes. Bruised bodies, dry skin, hurt ribs, dehydrated rage. Akuense says it's canoe jail. The white skin of a tree is for slicing and peeling and feeling and rolling and cutting and sewing and pitching and floating and traveling. Akuense says, oh, you're so proud of your collection of Indians. Good job, Jaganash. Good job. Quiet is praying to those old ones by dipping her fingers into a plastic bottle of water and rubbing the drops on the spine of each canoe. Soft words, wet fingers, wet backs. Akawetse and Kwe are looking each canoe in the eye. One whispers back, take the young one and run. Kwe looks at Akawetse. Akawetse takes the sage over to the security guard and teaches him how to smudge the canoe bodies. Fake cop is basking in guilt-free importance. Kwe takes the young one off the rack and onto her shoulders. She puts her in the flatbed and drives to Shimon. She pulls her out into the middle of the lake, sinks her with 7 stones, just enough to fill her with lake and suspend her in wet. Kwe sings the song, and she sings back. Kwe sings the song, and she sings back.
Special thank you to our panelists for an extraordinary panel. Thank you, Leanne, for sharing your artwork with us. Thank you, Julian, for helping me curate this amazing evening. Thank you, Nicole, for coming all the way from Seattle. Thank you, Jaskiran, for coming all the way from the new school. Thank you, Anna, for everything you do. All right, it was an amazing panel. I really am deeply grateful. And see you for the last 1313 on April 26th on the Counter-Revolution. Thank you.